Hey everybody, happy Wax on Wednesdays. I've got a lot of questions lately about fusing the first layers of your board flat, so I thought this would be a good week to really just kind of go back to basics and go over how I get the flat base layers before I begin my painting. I'm starting out today with a 10 by 10 wood cradle board. I've already taped off the sides and I'm just slightly warming the board with my heat gun. Now if you use a torch, it's the same. Just keep your torch away from the wood a little bit. You don't want to scorch the wood, but just slightly warm the board. And you can see I'm putting my hand there to see if I'm just gently warming it. I've got it on a very low setting right now, my heat gun, and I would do the same if I had my torch, just very low, slightly warming the board. This is going to help with getting out any air bubbles. It's going to help in, you can see as I lay it down there, it's also going to help to smoothly add that wax, because wax of course is going to solidify immediately as soon as it hits a cold surface. So by slightly warming your board, then you have a little bit more time to get that wax down before it's going to solidify. So before your brush starts skipping on you, if you've ever had that feeling when you were adding the base layers that your brush is skipping on you, it's solidifying, it's not letting you lay a nice smooth layer down, it's because your surface is very cold and your wax is solidifying very quickly. So by slightly warming that board up, you have more time, and the bigger the piece, the bigger your cradle board. If you just slightly warm, say the part that you're working on, it'll help ensure a nice smooth layer going down. Now you can see that I am gently fusing it. Again, I've got it on a very low setting here, my heat gun, and I'm fusing out all of the air bubbles and all of the brush strokes all at the same time. This is what I call over fusing, and I'm fusing this to basically a liquefied puddle, and not to the point where it's just all going to run off the board, but it is over fusing. I won't have to fuse it this much for the rest of the painting. This first few layers, I want to ensure that I get all those air bubbles out. I want to ensure that I get all the brush strokes out, the lumps, the bumps. I can always go add texture back in later on purposefully. I want to make sure that I have a nice flat base to begin my painting with. Fusing my second layer in, you can see that my wrist is going in small circles all around this board, and that I'm not keeping my heat gun in the same place too long. And a lot of times when you're first starting out, that's the mistake you make, is honing in on a certain bubble or bump or lump, and the wax, if you keep the heat implement, whether you're using a torch or a heat gun, if you keep it in the same place too long, the wax is going to spread right back down to the wood. And you're going to end up with a much bigger blemish than the one that you were trying to concentrate on. So by going over small circles all around the board and just doing it gently over several minutes and not being too anxious, just gently going over the entire board, you will liquefy each area, and all of the air bubbles and the lumps and bumps and brush strokes will come right out. Now here on this third layer, I usually add it depends on the size of the board. In this case of a 10 by 10, usually 4 to 6 layers of white encaustic paint I add. You don't have to add white encaustic paint. You can add any color that you want, including clear. So it's whatever works the best with your type of painting. This is the base layer for any type of encaustic painting. So whether you are abstract or still life, landscape, whatever that type of encaustic that you're working on, this serves for all purposes, except for laying a photograph or a collage down first. This is the base layers that you're going to be starting out with. So you can start out with any color that you like. If you'd like to start out with black, if that works for your painting method, then start out with black, clear, white, whatever color that you're working on. This is the same method that you would use to achieve nice flat base layers, especially if you're going to be doing a photo transfer. This is very important that you get everything flat with no air bubbles and no brush strokes, no lumps, no bumps as you go. And you can see that I am fusing in between each and every layer that I add. I'm making sure that that surface is flat with no air bubbles, no lumps, no bumps, each and every layer. So I'm not packing on a bunch of layers and then trying to fuse it all out. I'm doing building as I go, and I'm fusing every single layer as I go. Now, right now, as you heat and as you begin to add these layers, the board is going to remain warmer and warmer each layer of wax that you add. It's going to remain warm for a longer period of time. So it's going to take longer for that wax to solidify the more layers that you add. So you can see there I was testing the board with my gloved hand to make sure that the board was cool enough that I could add another layer of wax. Each base layer that I add, and if I'm adding say 5 or 6 base layers, I'm really going to start checking that board and having to wait just a bit longer for that wax to solidify in between layers, because the board is going to remain warm. And you can test this out by, say, after you've added your 3rd or 4th layer, you can lift your board and feel underneath and feel that that center of the wood is still very, very, very warm. And that's because the wood is retaining this heat. It's got several layers of wax, of hot wax on it, and the wood is now retaining that heat. So it's going to take a little bit longer to solidify, and you really want to wait until that wax is hardened before you go and add another layer of wax. And the reason is, if you add another layer too soon, you'll just be dragging your brush, dragging that wax right off the board again. And this is another frustration that a lot of new students get, is that they want to add that wax a little bit faster, get their base layers down a little bit faster. And if your board is too warm, even though it looks solidified, that hot brush with that hot wet wax going back on the board is going to end up dragging off more wax than it's adding, because it's immediately liquefying the wax that's on the board. So wait just that couple extra minutes and make sure that your wax is solidified all the way through before you go and add your next layer of wax. Now here I have a case where there's a little bit of debris in my wax. So I'm just going to dig it out with tweezers or a toothpick, and this is probably some debris from from filtering the encaustic medium. It still has a little bit of the forest debris from the Damar resin in it. So I'm just going to go, that didn't get filtered out. So I'm just going to go ahead and pick that right out and fuse it right back up. It's no big deal. Now that I've have everything nice and fused flat, just picking out a little bit of those bumps is just really easy, and it's easy to go back and fuse everything nice and flat again. So of course in this video, I'm not showing the 15 minutes or so that I waited between this next layer to before I went and added more wax. So know that as I go between these layers, I am waiting a few minutes in between each time, and I don't want to bore you to death with that, but I'm waiting a few minutes in between each layer. So as I go, maybe between the 1st and 2nd layer, it was maybe 5 minutes, and as I go between the 4th and 6th layer, I would say I probably waited about 15 minutes before I went and added the next layer. And I check my board, I check it on top, I check it underneath, because I really want to make sure that my wax is solid before I go ahead and add that next layer of wax. And you can see here too that I am still going in circles around the board, and my board is nice and warm, so I'm not getting all those bubbles that I did in the 1st layer. And that's another thing that you can see as well, is that the 1st layer I got a lot of air bubbles, not a tremendous amount because I did warm my board, but there were still quite a few there. And now on this 4th, 5th layer, there's not quite as many air bubbles. The board is still warm, and there's not as many to fuse out as there was before, and also not as many lumps and bumps. And a lot of people will ask me if they can add the 4 or 5 wax layers, and then fuse out the bumps and the lumps and the bumps and the brush strokes. And I really would advise against it because it's like a snowball. So the more that you wax that you add over that lump or that bump, the bigger it's going to get. It's like a snowball effect. So by fusing each layer nice and flat as you go, you're going to make sure that you really have a nice flat board to begin with, and it's going to save you a lot of headaches in the end before you begin your painting. You can also see that I've changed a little bit in the way that I'm fusing the board, and I'm going long strokes up and down, and that is because all the wax is liquefied, and I really want to make sure that everything is flat. And sometimes it will tend to bunch up in some areas, maybe from the heat gun, the air blowing on the heat gun, or even the torch will begin to separate the wax and have it lump up. So by going back and forth in these long strokes up and down, back and forth, I'm also ensuring that that wax is nice and flat. And again, you didn't see it, but I did wait 15 minutes in between this last layer of wax. Now, if you prefer a torch instead of a heat gun, this is the exact same process. I would put my torch on low and really just take my time and fuse every single layer the exact same way as I do my heat gun. I find a lot of times it's beneficial to have a prep day where I'm working on maybe 4 or 5 boards at once. I like to paint on more than one board at a time, so I like to just use a whole day and prep a bunch of these boards. And that way, when I'm waiting 15 minutes in between, 15-20 minutes depending on the size, in between each layer, when I get further down the line, I can just switch off, push that board aside, and fuse the next board. And that way I'm doing a bunch of boards at once, and I get a lot of boards done at one time. This also works if I'm working on a much larger piece, then I'm going to wait even longer in between layers. So if I'm working on a much larger panel, then I can do a bunch of smaller ones in between while I'm waiting for that layer on the larger board to solidify. So if I'm working on a much larger piece, then I can get a bunch of smaller ones done while I wait. There's also no rule of how many base layers that you have to put down. So if I am putting 4 to 6 layers on a 10 by 10, that's just my choice. And you can put as many base layers down as is needed for your type of painting. So this is just my little rule of thumb that works for me and for my painting process, but you can certainly put any amount of layers down for your base layers that you see fit that's going to add to your process. So it depends on what you're adding to the painting and what your painting process requires. So for me, for this size, 4 to 6 layers works out perfectly. Now here I am again with the long strokes, both up and down and back and forth, really making sure that that wax is nice and flat. And I do get down to eye level of my work table and really make sure that there's no lumps, no hills there, that everything is nice and flat. And I do that between each layer that I add as well, just to check myself and make sure that everything is as flat as it looks from overhead. So if you're just joining us here on Wax on Wednesdays, I really hope that this video is helpful to you. And if you're just joining us on the channel, there's several places that you can join me for further encaustic instruction. And I have a full line called Encausticology online workshops on my website at sherryreplogel.com. And you can also join me every single week on the Patreon channel for where I actually go through just like this step by step through each video and let you know how I go about doing every single painting that's on Wax on Wednesdays. So the links are right below the video if you would like to check any of that out. And I hope that you'll subscribe and come back every Wednesday to see what we are making here in the wonderful world of Encaustic. We will see you next Wednesday, and happy Wax on Wednesdays.